Well, it's hard to narrow down what to talk about today. There's so much going on. New York has just extended their lockdown for another 2 weeks. No surprise there. And they're not the only state. Apparently, a bunch of other East Coast states, those densely populated hellholes are, just rife with infection. And so nobody there is allowed to go outside for at least until May 15th. And I guess the original expiration date on their lockdown was the end of this month, which is in 2 weeks, so about a month total, but who knows, by then they very well might extend the lockdown again. But this is such a fluid situation that, it's really hard to predict that because, as something that, a dichotomy that Chris Martenson, I think, pinpointed very early on was that, once before people were really worried about this, he was saying that there's going to be a tug of war once the world figures out that this whole virus thing is a big problem, and that pull is going to be between trying to lock things down and to keep people from spreading the virus, and then on the other side, keeping the economy and thus civilization from collapsing. And of course, it's about a lot more than just stocks. Everybody who is at all concerned about the economy now is getting mocked for just caring about the stock market. I absolutely am not someone who cares about the stock market. I want to see the stock market burn. And, if you look at stocks and see just how overvalued they still are, with all of this garbage going on, with unemployment where it's at, and I'll get to that in a second, it should become more apparent than ever that stocks have nothing to do with the economy. Just because the economy is going down does not mean stocks are going down. Stocks, for all I know, could hit new all-time highs while all this is going on. So while I'm sure that there are a lot of people who are not, that deeply entrenched in, in economic reality, who are just concerned about opening back up the economy because they're worried about their 401ks, it's incorrect to characterize us all that way. And of course, I'm not even necessarily someone who thinks that people should go back out in public. But I do think that it's very fair to be concerned about the economy. I think that it is unquestionable that the economy is being deeply, deeply damaged with all this going on. It's not, as I said in a comment yesterday, the economy is not like a light switch. You can't just turn it on and off. It's a living organism, so if you shut it off and you stop its heart, it's dead. Once it's dead, you don't just bring it back the way that it was before. It has to die. Its parts have to break down and go back into the soil, and then something new will sprout. But that takes a long time, and by the time you do get there, you're nowhere near where you were before. You end up in a very, very different world. And so this tug of war is really between people who see the immediate threat of this virus and are desperate to try and avoid it, very understandably so, because as we're learning more and more about this virus, it doesn't seem very fun. Because we've known all along, for example, that this virus, would attack your lungs and incapacitate them and make it so that essentially they could not intake any oxygen, so that they were the parts of the lung that actually absorb the oxygen and oxygenate your blood, they would just cease to function. We're seeing that the virus is also having similar effects on other organs. And so all this feeds into the appropriate fear of individuals who do not want this thing getting around, who want to try and do everything that's possible to stop people from getting this and dying horrible deaths, even if it is, only a single-digit percentage of the people who actually, are confirmed to have this. But there are also people who have a little bit of a longer-term, or in some cases a short-term, outlook when they look at the economy and they see all the damage that is being done here. And they begin to consider just how long and how difficult it will be to rebuild everything that's being destroyed right now. These aren't people complaining, about how, I want to go to a baseball game. Let me go to a baseball game. No, these are people who are very worried because they're going out of business, because their employers are going out of business, because they can't pay their rent. And there's nothing, in my view, that the government can do to, ease that pain entirely to the point to where people do not feel it. For example, they've been trying these small business loans through the Small Business Administration to give people loans to extend their payroll and keep people on payroll. and not lay them off while everything is on hold and businesses are doing nothing and taking in no income. But the funds allocated to this program for lending to these businesses was just a small fraction of that $2.2 trillion stimulus bill that was passed not too long ago. And of course, the rest of that money pretty much, all went to corporate boondoggles. It is, of course, always the important people who get bailed out. And funny story from a couple days ago when people were starting to worry that, hey, this money in this small business, these small business loans are going to run out here in a couple days. We were hearing reports that hedge funds, those guys who manage the money of the top tenth of 1% folks, yeah, they were applying for these small business loans to keep their people on payroll, and I can't imagine, how much their employees make a piece. But technically, they could do that because, a hedge fund doesn't have very many employees relative to the amount of money they're dealing with, because they have highly skilled people. They have quants and things and analysts, and it's not a massive massive firm. Of course, a hedge fund can only manage the accounts of, I think, less than 100 people. So anyway, the money's out, and there's a big fight in Congress now about allocating more money and how I guess Democrats want to work other things into the bill, and I don't follow any of that political crap. It's just it's a waste of time. But I think gridlock over this stuff is going to increase the demands for people to ease the lockdowns, because they're looking at this and they're saying, hey, I'm stuck at home, I can't work, and Congress isn't doing anything to make it better. Congress's role here in allocating all this, stimulus money was supposed to rekindle optimism in the economy. They were supposed to be keeping people confident that, okay, we're having this lockdown, but don't worry, we got your back, and we're just going to give everyone away free money. Even though, as I've stated in the past, printing money is not an economy. It's not like this money is coming from the taxpayer. This money is coming from issuing debt that's being bought up by the Fed and being created out of thin air. But they haven't even been able to do that right. So we've got pessimism all around. People who are very pessimistic about the outlook for this virus, who think that the virus is a very big deal, which it is, and that it is an existential threat. And then on the other hand, you have people who are equally as pessimistic about the prospects for the U.S. economy. Who think that we're going into a Great Depression, which wouldn't surprise me. The problem is that, of course, when everyone else has had record high confidence in everything and thought that and everyone was told that this is such a wonderful booming economy, it's the best economy in American history. When people come from that big of a high down to the low that I've been at for a while, I mean, that's a very big swing. And psychologically, it's not something that a lot of people can process that well. And so you're going to see people who are quite angry about this, who are going to lash out in different ways. And these protests that we've seen in places like yesterday, I believe in Michigan, or maybe I already talked about Michigan, but that reopened North Carolina protests, these very little protests, you're going to start seeing more and more of that because people are frustrated. And like I said, it's about much more than the lockdown. They're frustrated with the economy. They're frustrated with the virus. They're frustrated with Congress. They're frustrated with their governors. And of course, many people are going to be very frustrated with their families because, we don't exactly have very close, tight-knit families these days. People are very used to just going about their business and, only seeing their children or their spouse, for a few minutes every day, maybe 30 minutes. Isn't that like one of those things that you hear about on commercials, like, oh, try to spend at least 30 minutes a day with your family, have a meal together or something. And most people don't even hit that target. Now everyone's spending 24 hours a day together. So before I forget about the economy, I teased it earlier, but we got the unemployment numbers for this week. I believe it was over 5 million people filed for unemployment, and so over the past month, 22 million people have filed for unemployment. And again, this is just people who have filed, not necessarily everyone who's out of work, because if you are self-employed, for example, and you can't work, you can't file for unemployment because you don't pay into unemployment insurance, you don't have an employer. But just using the people who have filed for unemployment, it looks like, considering that unemployment was somewhere around like 3.5%, I think, before all this got started, 22 divided by about 150 million working people in this country comes out to like 15%. And so if you add that to the 3.5, we're somewhere around 18% unemployment right now. It's almost 1/5 of the entire American labor force. That doesn't just go away by flipping a switch, by saying, okay, America's open for business, and now everybody can go back to work. And so what this means in the long term is that you're going to have a lot of people who are unemployed for a very long time. You're going to have a class of people who just cannot provide for themselves. And beyond that, the people who are working probably will have to accept less pay in a less enjoyable job, one that they perhaps wouldn't have chosen, but it was whatever job they could get. And this is not in a country like, say, I don't know, Germany or France, or even England to a certain extent, although the United Kingdom overall, this doesn't really apply. But my point is that this is not in some kind of cohesive nation state where you have people who identify with each other and have existed for hundreds of years as a single unit and see themselves as some sort of organic entity. People who whether or not they might disagree with their neighbors on things or have problems in their life, at the end of the day they're still French, they're still German, they're still Italian, they're still whatever. They have a cultural heritage which is deeply rooted, even though a lot of them have had a lot of experiences lately with bringing in migrants from other countries and other cultures and trying to integrate them to varying levels of success, mostly not successful. That idea of a cultural nation still does exist. And so what I'm getting at is that even if you have the state crumble under the weight of some terrible pressure, like, let's say Germany after World War II, or Italy after World War II, or France after many of its wars, which it's lost and been completely destroyed. The nation still existed. That's why after World War II, France was able to rise from its ashes, even though it had been destroyed by the Germans. And same, once the Cold War was over, Germany, regained itself and became a unified state again, because that's sort of the natural order of things. But in the United States, we're not held together by that same kind of glue. The U.S. is a very, very diverse place ideologically, culturally, and of course racially. But I don't put as much stock in skin color, but obviously along with those different shades of people, you get very different shades of culture and things. Very different ideas about history, both American history and world history. And so, in America we have a society of people who, on a very fundamental level, don't have very much in common with one another. I have about as much in common with, all Americans as I do, say, all Americans and all Australians. Not sure if that makes sense. I guess kind of my point is that, someone like me and someone from New York are about as different from each other as a Canadian is from me, or an Australian is from me, or a New Zealander is from a Canadian. What we have in common is that we speak English and grew up in a in a world where the law is based on English common law. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot in common. And so what I'm getting at here is that, the United States is not a traditional nation. It is, in my view, an economic nation, much like China. China does not have, a unified culture, even though sinicization has been a long-standing policy of every Chinese regime, even before the communists. They've never really achieved it. China's a pretty diverse, massive country. But what has been able to hold them together is this promise that, hey, you swear loyalty to the Communist Party and we'll give you prosperity. Well, the same has essentially become truth here in the United States. As power has become more and more centralized in Washington, the idea is that, hey, we'll give you safety and prosperity and a good job and a happy life as long as you keep trading away, your sovereignty in forms of, in the form of states and localities and things, and give more and more power to Washington. We'll take care of things. And so I think that once, Americans get a taste of what it's like to not have that prosperity, to have that bargain broken, that implicit bargain, I think that you'll find that there's not a whole lot of support for the United States as it exists currently. And I don't mean necessarily that, states like New York are going to secede or something like that. I just mean that in terms of the political reality, that there will be no unity amongst the states. It will become increasingly clear that there is no political center in the United States, that there is no point of agreement. Much in the same way that the EU is going to, suffer a similar fate eventually. It could be as a result of this virus, but at this point, the EU is not nearly as centralized as the United States. But ultimately, the reasons why the EU will fail are the same as the reasons why the U.S. will fail. There's a fundamental weakness in our Constitution, and I don't mean the piece of paper, the Constitution. I mean that the way that that our government is constituted in practice. The structure of our government and the structure of our society are incongruent. So long as times are good, that's not such a big deal because people don't really notice that incongruity. However, if our established order is put to the test and there's any sort of stress applied, you'll find that like we're witnessing right now, it's very difficult for the system to cope. And so what end up happening is that people must take, extra legal recourse to redressing their grievances to the government, and that will mean civil unrest. Plenty of states and countries in the past have collapsed. But many of them have been able to come back from the brink, not because the state was inherently strong to begin with, not because it wasn't thoroughly crushed, but because the people who lived in the territory that state once governed wanted something of a similar framework to come back. After World War II, the French people wanted there to still be a France. After the Cold War, the German people still wanted there to be a Germany. But after the Wu flu, will Americans still want there to be an America? I highly doubt it, because by that point, all the benefits of being an American, I think, will have been stripped away. People won't have their freedom, and they won't have their prosperity. And the only thing that there would be left to hold a nation together at that point would be, sort of their love and their fraternity for one another. But I certainly don't think that any of that exists on a national level in the United States. And it certainly won't once things are pushed even further. The divisions in this country will only be exacerbated by stress. They will not be tamped down on. Americans, no longer have the capability to unite against some common enemy, coming in from the outside. They're much more likely to blame each other. And that's why, we've seen, something that I didn't even think was possible, the politicization of this virus. People making it all about Trump or, about the Democrats or whatever. And, to me, I don't have enough time to worry about that aspect of it. I don't even, frankly, understand, what's so political about all this. I mean, they're politicizing the damn drug hydroxychloroquine. And so that, to me, is just further evidence of America's impending downfall. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.